Picture this: a tennis stadium built to hold almost 24,000 people, and it still isn't big enough. That's the scene unfolding right now at Flushing Meadows, where a 21-year-old from the Philippines hasn't even stepped onto the court for her first singles match of the tournament. And already the US Open has had to change the way it operates just to keep up with the demand surrounding her. Officials there have started setting up giant viewing screens outside Arthur Ashe Stadium, because thousands of fans who traveled to watch her are showing up and discovering there simply isn't a seat left inside. That's not a normal Tuesday at a Grand Slam. That's something else entirely. And her name is Alex. If you've been anywhere near tennis Twitter or TikTok over the last few months, you've probably already heard whispers of what people are now calling the Alex effect. But what's happening in New York right now takes it to a level nobody, not even the tournament organizers themselves, really saw coming. So let's rewind for a second and actually walk through how a rising player who isn't even a top 10 name yet has managed to turn the biggest tennis tournament in the world completely upside down. Because the numbers involved here are almost hard to believe, and the story behind them says a lot about where tennis is heading, who's driving it, and just how much power a single fan base can have when it shows up in force. Start with the ticket prices, because that's where this whole thing becomes impossible to ignore. A grounds pass for the US Open, the basic ticket that gets you onto the grounds without a guaranteed seat in the main stadium, has an official face value of $65 this year. That's already a bit higher than in past seasons, but nothing outrageous for a major sporting event. Except that same pass has been reselling on the secondary market for over $360. Not double, not triple, nearly 6 times what it's actually supposed to cost. And when people started noticing that number circulating online, it set off exactly the kind of reaction you'd expect. A mix of disbelief, frustration, and a whole lot of questions about who's actually benefiting from this surge, and why regular fans are the ones footing the bill. Now, to be fair, the tournament itself only raised its official price by a few dollars this year. The real story is what's happening on the resale side, where scarcity and demand have collided in a way that's pushed prices into territory nobody expected. According to ticket tracking data reported by outlets covering the tournament, the average price, just to get in the gate for the opening rounds, had climbed to somewhere around $300 by the middle of August, a noticeable jump from where things sat at the same point last year. And that's just the average. The cheapest available seats inside Arthur Ashe Stadium for early sessions were going for well over $300 themselves, while seats in Louis Armstrong Stadium, the second largest court on the grounds, were reportedly listed even higher than that. If you wanted something closer to the action for one of the marquee matches, you were looking at numbers that stopped being about tennis and started looking like a stock market chart. Some resale listings for center court seats at the men's final reportedly crossed $21,000. Let that sink in for a second. $21,000 for a single ticket to watch a tennis match. And when the pre-sale window opened for the biggest sessions, one fan posted a screenshot showing they were sitting behind more than 400,000 other people in a virtual waiting room, all trying to get their hands on tickets for the men's singles final. Another fan pointed out that a seat which had cost around $600 the previous year was now listed at 4 times that amount for the same spot this time around. So yes, ticket prices at the US Open have officially become their own headline, separate from anything happening on the actual court. But here's where Alex enters the picture, and where things start to get genuinely fascinating. Because while ticket prices have been climbing across the board for reasons that have more to do with scarcity, resale markets, and general tournament economics, there's a very specific, very identifiable surge tied directly to her matches. And it's been building for months before she even got to New York. Go back to earlier in the summer, to Toronto, where Alex was playing in a tournament that, under normal circumstances, wouldn't necessarily be drawing sellout crowds for a player still working her way up the rankings. Except, that's exactly what happened. Night after night, whenever she stepped onto the court, the stands filled up completely. The tournament director there went on record saying he had never seen anything quite like it, calling the response to her matches unexpected in a way that genuinely caught the event off guard. That wasn't a one-off either. A few weeks later in Cincinnati, the pattern repeated itself, except this time the numbers were even more dramatic. Ticket prices for sessions featuring her jumped by around 70% compared to a typical night. And even at that inflated price point, the stadium still sold out completely. At that point, people covering the tour started paying closer attention, because 2 tournaments in a row showing the exact same behavior isn't a coincidence, it's a pattern, and patterns tend to repeat. Which brings us back to New York, where that same pattern didn't just repeat, it exploded. The moment it was announced that Alex would be playing a mixed doubles match on Arthur Ashe Stadium, something shifted almost immediately. Word spread fast, especially within the Filipino community both locally in New York and internationally, and thousands of fans started making their way to Flushing Meadows specifically for that one match. Philippine flags started appearing throughout the grounds. Chants of her name began echoing around the complex well before the match even started. And by the time the gates opened wide enough for the crowd to funnel in, it became clear that a huge number of these fans were going to be left without seats. Because the stadium, the largest tennis venue on the planet, had already filled up completely. That's the moment the US Open made its move, setting up massive screens just outside the stadium so the overflow crowd, the fans who couldn't physically fit inside, could still watch the match unfold in real time. Think about that for a second. This is a venue that was specifically built decades ago because the tournament had already outgrown its previous home. And now, even with all that added capacity, it still wasn't enough to contain the crowd chasing one specific player who hasn't even played her first singles match of the event yet. In the sport's history, overflow crowds at majors have typically just been turned away or redirected to smaller outer courts. That's simply how it's always worked. But this time, organizers made the call to give everyone a way to watch, because turning away that many people, especially people who had traveled specifically for this, apparently wasn't an option anymore. When the match actually got underway, the atmosphere inside Arthur Ashe was something else entirely. Alex and her mixed doubles partner, a well-known men's player currently ranked inside the world's top 5, came out strong, taking the opening game of the match. But the pair on the other side of the net, a husband and wife tennis duo with years of chemistry built from playing together both on and off the court, settled in quickly and started controlling the rhythm of the match, eventually pulling away and wrapping things up in well under an hour to move on to the next round. On paper, it was a straightforward loss, but nobody walking out of that stadium or standing outside watching on the big screens was talking about the score. They were talking about what they'd just witnessed. ATTD. Crowd surge unlike anything the tournament had ever experienced for a player at her stage of her career. Her partner for the match, visibly moved by the reception, spoke afterward about what it felt like being on the receiving end of that kind of energy, admitting it was almost funny given that she's younger than him in both age and experience on tour, but acknowledging that she's clearly the one carrying the crowd with her wherever she plays. A former US Open finalist turned commentator had actually predicted this exact outcome weeks earlier, saying on his podcast that he expected her to fill stadiums the same way she had in Toronto, describing her as someone who genuinely thrives under the pressure of a big stage rather than shrinking from it. And when you look at what's happened since, it's hard to argue with that read. So why is this happening? Why has one player, still working her way up rather than already sitting at the top of the rankings, managed to generate this level of demand? Part of it comes down to representation. The Philippines has never had a tennis star reach this level of global visibility before, and for a country with a massive, passionate, and deeply loyal fan base both at home and scattered across the world through its diaspora communities, watching one of their own compete on the biggest stages in the sport carries a weight that goes beyond just sports fandom. It becomes something closer to a national moment every time she steps on court. And the numbers back that up in a very concrete way. More than 35,000 fans, specifically connected to the Filipino community, reportedly tried to secure tickets around her sessions at this year's tournament. A number that on its own overwhelmed parts of the ticketing system trying to process that kind of surge. Part of it also comes down to timing. Tennis has been actively searching for new storylines and new faces to build around, especially as some of the sport's most dominant recent figures start to age out of their primes or deal with injuries. A young, charismatic, clearly talented player who also happens to be capable of moving an entire fan base into stadiums is exactly the kind of storyline the sport has been hungry for, whether it fully realized it or not. And then there's simply the human element of it. The fact that watching someone climb, watching someone earn their moment rather than having already arrived at the top, tends to create a different, more emotionally invested kind of following than watching an established champion defend territory they've already claimed. People want to be there for the beginning of something, and right now, a lot of people seem convinced they're watching the beginning of something real. The tournament itself has clearly taken notice, and not just with the giant screens. Concession stands around the grounds have started adding Filipino dishes to their menus, specifically dishes like adobo and lumpia, mirroring exactly what happened at the Toronto and Cincinnati stops earlier in the summer, when organizers there made the same adjustment in response to the crowds she was drawing. It's a small detail in the grand scheme of a massive international sporting event, but it says something meaningful about how seriously tournaments are now treating this particular fan base, adjusting not just seating logistics, but the actual food offerings on site to reflect who's showing up and why. Meanwhile, the broader ticket pricing controversy has continued to swirl around the tournament, and it's worth separating that from the specific surge tied to her matches. Even though the two stories have obviously become intertwined in a lot of the coverage, high-profile voices have weighed in on the overall pricing situation, including a well-known billionaire investor who publicly questioned, through a social media post, how a nonprofit organization whose stated mission includes growing and promoting the sport of tennis could justify grounds passes reselling at nearly 6 times face value. That kind of criticism landed hard enough that it eventually reached the desk of New York City's mayor, who stepped in and announced a batch of 1,000 discounted tickets specifically for city residents, priced at just $100 each with a key condition attached: that these particular tickets could not be resold through the usual resale platforms where prices have been spiraling. The idea being that at least a portion of the crowd wanting to watch tennis in their own city could do so without needing to compete against scalpers and resale bots for the privilege. It's a relatively small gesture in the context of a tournament processing hundreds of thousands of ticket transactions, but it reflects just how much public pressure has built up around the pricing situation this year. And when you step back and compare what's happening at the US Open to the other Grand Slam tournaments around the world, the gap becomes almost jarring. A grounds pass for the opening week at Wimbledon runs somewhere in the neighborhood of £45. At the French Open, a similar entry-level ticket sits around the same rough figure once converted, somewhere close to €40. Even the Australian Open, which is still months away for its upcoming edition, has priced its comparable entry ticket at under $50 Australian. Compare any of those numbers to the $300+ fans are paying just to get in the gate on day one in New York, and you start to understand why so many people are frustrated. Roughly speaking, getting into the US Open on opening day costs something like 8 times what it costs to walk through the gates at Wimbledon for a similar experience. A big part of that gap comes down to how resale actually works at each event. At the French Open, for example, tickets can only legally be resold at their original face value, which effectively kills off the kind of runaway secondary market pricing that's become normal in the United States. In New York, tickets can be resold at essentially whatever price the market will bear. And when you combine that lack of a ceiling with a surge in demand tied to a breakout star, You get exactly the kind of numbers we've been talking about this whole time. Now, all of this pricing drama exists somewhat separately from the story of what Alex herself is actually doing on the court. And it's worth remembering that despite all the noise surrounding ticket prices and crowd sizes, she still has a tournament to play. She's entered in 3 separate events this time around, starting with that mixed doubles run alongside her partner in the top 5, which has now come to an end after their quarterfinal loss to the veteran husband and wife pairing. She's also set to take part in an exhibition-style showcase match against another notable player, the kind of event that tournaments often use to generate extra buzz and give fans another chance to see marquee names outside the pressure of a normal competitive match. But the one everyone is really circling on the calendar is her women's singles debut in the US Open main draw, which gets underway starting on August 30th. That's the moment this entire ticket surge has really been building toward, because up until now, everything we've talked about, the giant screens, the sold-out sessions in Toronto and Cincinnati, the 35,000 fans scrambling for access, has happened around her without her even having played a single singles match at this tournament yet. Once she actually steps onto the court in the main draw, the real test begins. Not just of how she performs against opponents who are, on paper, more experienced and higher ranked, but of whether this level of attention can sustain itself once actual results start coming in. Through it all, Alex herself has remained remarkably grounded about the entire situation. When reporters have asked her directly about the crowds, the demand, the sold-out stadiums following her from city to city, she's kept her answers simple, saying essentially that she tries not to overthink any of it, that once she's actually out on the court focused on the match in front of her, none of the outside noise really changes what she has to do. It's the kind of composure that's easy to admire, especially in a 21-year-old suddenly finding herself at the center of a phenomenon that's reshaping how a Grand Slam tournament operates in real time. Because make no mistake, what's happening right now at Flushing Meadows isn't just about one player being popular. It's a tournament with decades of history, one of the biggest and most prestigious events in all of sports, having to physically adjust its infrastructure, add screens, add food options, adjust its approach to overflow crowds, all because the demand tied to one rising star outpaced what even their largest stadium could hold. That's not something that happens often, and when it does happen, it tends to mark a turning point, not just for the player at the center of it, but for the sport as a whole in terms of who it's reaching and how far that reach can extend. Whether Alex goes on to make a deep run in the singles draw or bows out earlier than her fans are hoping, the impact she's already had on this tournament, the fact that people are now studying crowd numbers and resale prices specifically because of